So now it's my pleasure to introduce a colleague who's been with us at every episode since March, Pete Comeau, Managing Director of Phocuswright. Over to you, Pete.
Thanks a lot, Soo-Hoon, and good evening, Singapore and Asia Pacific region. Once again, I am pleased to share some key data and trends from our library of research, this time focused on startups. But before I get there, I would like to reflect back on this inspiring road trip, share some of my highlights, and also look forward to meeting again in person during WiT Experience Week in late October, and then at the Phocuswright conference in mid-November. As Jerry Garcia mused, what a long, strange trip it's been. And I want to thank Soo-Hoon for providing us a roadmap to guide us on this journey. As I reflect back on this roadshow, 3 sessions stand out for me. As Tim Hughes was sharing his prison story in episode 2 from Bangkok, he made a statement that really resonated with me. He said, "I need to travel. I need to go home." What he was referring to partially was all the family events he missed in Australia over the last year. But he was also referring to travel as his home. As I pack my bags for a short trip to New York City from Denver tomorrow, I get butterflies in my belly thinking about leaving my physical home and heading to my travel home. I also thoroughly enjoyed kicking off episode 4 with Soo-Hoon and my colleague and friend Kevin May from Phocuswright as we put a wrapper on some of the biggest stories from the past year. While the 3 of us were thousands of miles and many time zones apart, it seemed like we were right next to each other, sharing our thoughts on what important developments have shaped our industry and what they all will mean for the future. And lastly, just last month during episode 5, I thoroughly enjoyed Greg Schultz's session where he shared some research about traveler behavior and what changes have occurred during the past year, and also what travelers are dreaming about as they think about their next trip. As I shared with you last month, travel is and will always be central to people's identity. But as the travel industry suffered over the last year, many of us have had time to reflect on why we miss travel and what makes travel such an important part of our life. WiT will host a homecoming in October in Singapore, so we can collectively work to define how to bring the industry that we love from 0.0 to infinity.0. Then, roughly a month later, the Phocuswright team will host a reunion of our own, where we will define travel's renaissance and collaborate with the most important and smartest minds in our industry on how we can build back smarter, bolder, and better. I invite all of you to join us, either in person, if you can, or remotely through our virtual conference apps, and take part in these exceptionally important discussions. Now on to our 6th session of Stats and Stuff. Once again, I'll share 5 charts in 5 minutes, this time focused on the state of travel startups. What are entrepreneurs building? What are they focused on? Who is getting funded? And more. Here at Phocuswright, we have a history of identifying startups poised to transform the industry. We have featured over 500 startups on our stages. Collectively, they've raised $5.5 billion. 353 have been funded, and just short of 100 of them have been acquired. So what is the current state of funding for travel startups? Well, that becomes the tale of 2 stories, pre-pandemic and during pandemic. If we consider the last decade or so, we looked at almost 3,000 digital travel startups founded since 2010, who collectively raised over $29 billion USD in funding during this time frame. Important to note that we pulled mobility startups from this analysis, as a lot of their business is local rather than travel related. Now let's consider how this has trended over the past decade. For global travel startups founded since 2010, funding had been growing in significant double digits practically every year in the last decade. 2019 was by far the biggest year in history for travel startups in terms of dollars raised, jumping from $5.8 billion in 2018 to $7.5 billion. In 2020, The shock to the travel industry induced by the pandemic caused funding to fall by 57% to $3.2 billion. But considering that the industry was at a virtual standstill for most of the year, we might have expected worse. For the first half of 2021, we're at almost half the funding of 2020, around $1.6 billion so far. As travel is opening up again, now we are seeing investors' confidence return, and we are very optimistic that funding activity will pick up in the second half of the year to exceed 2020. In terms of verticals receiving the most attention from entrepreneurs, accommodations account for 1 out of every 3 startups founded. Hotel and hostels sit at the top of the list with 575 companies founded focused on this category. They are working on price arbitrage, revenue management, meta search, channel management, and other things. Next is short-term rentals with 324 companies founded in this category. So why accommodation? Well, it's highly fragmented, highly competitive, and suppliers in this category have not been overly innovative. So now let's shift to horizontal. Bottom of the funnel is where the attention is. The majority of startups focus on the transaction, and over 30% are B2B companies supporting corporates and helping to drive innovation across the industry. We also have seen many B2C startups eventually pivot to B2B, and it is extremely difficult to reach scale when competing against the established incumbents, Booking, Expedia, etc. So who is capturing the lion's share of the funding, and what categories are they focused on? Interestingly enough, 50% are Asian startups, with Oyo checking in at nearly triple the next startup in terms of funding, TripActions. Hospitality and short-term rentals once again lead the way. Uplift, a travel fintech startup, comes in at 10. And just after this top 10 was compiled, Hopper raised another $175 million to jump into the top 10. Hopper is a mobile-only meta search site, also doubled down on financial products in the last year and added a B2B solution to broaden their market opportunity. So entrepreneurs thrive during times of crisis, and this pandemic has been no different. Sure, we have lots of our share of travel startups that have failed, but many have pivoted to address immediate opportunities, and more have been founded, focused on how to serve the changing industry as we emerge from this pandemic. I'm excited for this next session where Soo-Hoon brings together promising startups who are smack dab in the middle of reinventing the perfect road trip. Back to you, Soo-Hoon.